firstly, I'm just going to begin with some setup, and then secondly, I have one really long argument. So firstly, on some context, the US Congress, to a very unusual degree, are incredibly underpaid. Their salaries haven't gone up at all in the last 20 or so years. They're definitely not matching inflation, and they're making less and less money as a result. In addition to this, housing has also gone up, which has made the cost of living incredibly hard. I think why this is true is firstly, just the US economy has grown. US wages are growing, but the Congress aren't growing their wages specifically. And specifically in places like DC. I think that it's also important to note that specifically for these kind of roles, the wages have been growing in other areas. They just haven't been growing within the US kind of state politics. Second point on why this is true is that DC housing average grows a lot faster than other areas. This is just true because of the housing undersupply. Affluent people are going to seek places in these areas, right? Those kind of things. And also, a third kind of reason is ever since 1994, we've consistently seen this more toxic kind of view about Congress wages, people saying they are getting paid way too much, which means that they haven't grown in these last 20 years. Which means all of these changes we've seen with inflation, following all of the things like COVID and all of these really bad things, have caused all of these kind of things. So obviously, our model would just be to pay both Congress and their members of staff more. This would be to keep it with the inflation levels as you see in all other kind of job areas. We're going to kind of keep this debate focusing on a national level, but if Negative want to extend it to state, that's totally fine. They kind of benefit all of our arguments further. So leaving it up to Negative to decide. So yeah, our burden is just to not defend the status quo, where they are earning less and less money because inflation is rising and their wages aren't. Cool. Now onto my argument about why getting paid more equals better governance. So 5 key four. Sure.
This debate is about all elected officials. You can't just run away from things like even local levels. How are you going to integrate that in?
Oh yeah, I'll put in my points. That's totally fine. Sure. So cool. Why this is equals better governance when they're getting paid more. Firstly, we're just going to stop experienced people leaving. Note this does apply to local level, state level, national level. It applies to all of it. So firstly, why experienced people are good. Firstly, they have institutional knowledge. This is obviously of value because it means you can, you just have greater levels of competency. Incompetency is a massive issue in state governance and in all kind of levels of governance. And obviously experienced people have want to leave, right? If they're getting paid really badly, there's no point in them staying. They have this experience, they can go to other better paying jobs. Obviously when they have this experience, we want to keep it, which is really important. Secondly, the status quo with staff and Congress is that they kind of cycle about through working in Congress and also working in lobbying institutions. This is purely because their pay in Congress is incredibly low, right? They go into these lobbying jobs because they need to earn a whole bunch of money, right? And the harm with this is it just makes this massive conflict of interest, right? They work for things they go into areas of pharmacy or areas of tech, and they don't want to piss off these areas when they are working in Congress, because that is their future employment, so they can actually earn money, right? It means that when you do offer these individuals more money, or when they are being paid more money, they're unlikely to continue going into this roundabout kind of thing. And it's likely to be of a much less degree. If it does occur, it's likely to be way lower. Sure.
So why is it that these people would not similarly on your side simply just use politics as a springboard for getting into power or getting into a better consultancy position?
Yeah, so I think when you offer them more money, they're likely to be more comfortable with their job, right? I think it's really important to note that you have to make a lot of sacrifices when you go into Congress. You have to move to DC. It's quite a stressful environment, whereas you could just kind of be in a consulting area from the beginning if you had the possibilities. When you open up better pay, the sacrifice of these kind of things is weighed up a lot higher, right? They are willing to have all these sacrifices. They are willing to stay in this environment longer because they are now getting paid, and that does kind of balance out those things. The third kind of mechanism here is that we're likely to get more talented people. We're likely to get the people who are quite intelligent, are quite conscientious, and would go into these corporate kind of industries to begin with, because now they are getting paid at a similar level, right? They're able to balance up these before they couldn't financially justify it because it is just really hard, right? They had to move, maybe they wanted to stay with their family. That's obviously a financial burden that they have to find this new house in this really bad housing industry. They have to go about and settle into this new area. They have to engage in this really stressful kind of environment. I know that consultancy and politics probably have the same amount of stress in both environments. So now that you're able to pay more, the way up is a lot better. I think this is especially important for the vulnerable people or vulnerable groups who couldn't make this decision before, right? Because they just simply couldn't afford it. It was too much of a commitment, and this kind of reduces the structural inequality around this. Fourth kind of mechanism now is that why when you don't pay people good, you're just going to get worse people, right? When you take out the people who self-select themselves out, they self-select into other areas, you're left with people who are I don't know, kind of strange, kind of weird, kind of have really strong political ideologies left in Congress, which just equals really bad Congress. So weighing of this is just you're going to get long-term trust in the government. Firstly, because you're likely to just get better decisions. If we consider a natural disaster occurring, and you have to organize a compensation package, if we have incompetency we're currently seeing because of this constant cycle through all of these different people, it's going to take 5 years to organize this package. Whereas if we're able to keep all of our experienced people, if we're able to have all of these better people opt in to begin with and get elected in, it's probably likely only to take 3 years. Which means now that these people who have been affected by this natural disaster have 2 extra years of compensation rather than having to wait these 5 years for this compensation, which is really hard. But second thing to note here is that the government's trust is currently at rock bottom, right? No one trusts the government. It's why voting levels are so low. We're now able to get more care in the government system. We're able to get more people kind of caring about all of these things. Anyone have a quick POI? No, cool, awesome. Yeah, so when we're able to do all of these things, obviously this is really good. People are going to care more about politics. They're going to opt in to kind of caring, which also means you're likely to just have better people opting to kind of enroll in, right? When you consider your job kind of careers, now that you've seen from a younger age that the political system is better, this is now likely to be on people's radar from a younger age. Oh, maybe this is actually a really good job to go into because you do get paid better, because there are better kind of positive societal values towards it. And obviously that is a massive win, which only occurs on our side. Cool, thank you.
Desire people who have experience in politics. The problem is affirmative flip that mechanism, flip that incentive. Because what they do is that they make politics a tenable career for people who graduate university, people who weren't already in industry and have had that experience, who have built up the savings or other forms of connections. Which means that you don't get people who engage in industry, who have built up connections otherwise, people who know what the creation of policy looks like, and you don't get people who just genuinely care about politics. So the first thing that I'm going to do in this speech is contest affirmative's only benefit in the debate, that is who gets better politicians, and explaining why their side crowds out the ideal politician that we prefer. But I'm going to further extend the debate beyond affirmative's only one claim, and explain why secondly they incur more public debt, that is bad, and also why that further separates the America itself, noting that it's currently a very extreme and divisive and separated place at the moment. So setup will be integrated and also rebuttal. So the first point to explain is why this crowds out the ideal politician who we might want. The first thing to explain is what does this ideal politician likely look like. It's someone who we think actually cares about what's going on. We think it's also someone who isn't there solely for the point of money. We think it's someone who is dedicated for the point of a political cause. We don't care what political party they are for, but someone who just genuinely cares about pushing political beliefs, but someone who also has experience understanding how things specifically work. So then, what happens their side is that they lose that for 3 reasons. Why do we lose this politician? The first thing to explain is that you encourage political parties to vie for more, vie for people who specifically, have more on their resume rather than who care more about politics. Because voters are expecting now politicians who aren't maybe just as, voters are expecting politicians who have a lot on their resume, who have a lot they can potentially sell for, because they have to pay for the cost of this politician's salary. The problem then is that these political parties are now going to select for individuals who have work experience over things like political views and cares. they're going to select for people over the passion. That is specifically bad, because if you weigh the mechanism, the politician can only get into the political party if they can only get into politics. If they're supported by the political party, it is very hard to get into politics. You need, especially in America, you need to either be Democrat or Republican. You need to make it through often primaries and other sorts of selections. So the only way you're ever going to get in politics is if you're selected by the parties. When you change the party's interest to select for people who aren't as passionate, but for individuals who are just trying to sell the to like look like a green stamp, that then changes that in the sense. Second thing is that you encourage people to enter politics, and so that explains then why we outweigh their mechanism that provide it first affirmative, why then you should value that more highly. The second thing to explain is that it encourages people who want to go in more for money, because they immediately make the career more tenable for individuals who leave university. And the reason why is because they explain the mechanism themselves. They explain that oftentimes there isn't enough money at the moment to just immediately enter politics. That's bad then, because when you do that, you change to get people from like the highest universities, so i.e. you're encouraged to take people from things like the Ivy Leagues and the top grads and other things, because then they're immediately able to make money from politics. This is bad for the setup, and kind of this also links the same reason as like above, like you select for these individuals because they seem competent over other things. This is bad over selecting for someone who has potentially just like worked in your kind of like, you know, either local shops, someone who isn't, or someone who doesn't have as much experience, or someone who doesn't seem as credible, or someone who doesn't seek that money as much. Because these are individuals who wanted to work in politics. These are individuals who don't care as much about the money, so they're more likely to have political cause behind. And again, weigh the incentive. The point where if someone is unable to make money from politics, they have other reasons to enter it. Often those other reasons because they want to represent these things. So it suggests that this mechanism is more persuasive than what affirmative provide to you. The third mechanism to explain is that there's often a feedback loop. Once you get some of these people in politics who care about money, then you're more likely to get people you're more likely to kick out people who were previously passionate, because they get sick of the nonsense that is pushed by individuals who are in politics. That is for two reasons. Oftentimes these individuals who are selected under their side are more likely to make pro-corporate decisions. That is, after they leave politics, if they enter a university, they want to potentially seek a job after politics. So they're more likely to either set up pro-corporate decisions so they can either benefit themselves in these ways, or secondly, they just want to help their own career, i.e. these businesses see them as making decisions that are favorable to them, make that. But secondly, they also often do things like create fake consulting and focus groups within politics itself to reach the result they often want. Because a lot of Congress and a lot of what is required is that it goes through a lot of smaller councils rather than being decided before it goes to Congress itself. So there are a lot of subcommittees, and so when you encourage these individuals to make a lot of these these fake subcommittees in order to push the results that they want, you create new forms of politicking, new layers of bureaucracy, which only further turn off people who are in there for the passion, who are in there to represent their individuals. This then means that these individuals who are already a bit sick of politics just are pushed over the line because they don't see any benefit that can be gained, and now it means that they lose these politicians who actually care. What are the impacts of this? The first thing is that you're likely just to push out people on a local level. There are a set of individuals who currently, due to this policy of not getting paid as much, view politics as much of a side hustle because they cannot sustain it with their own salary. The framing is that you often recruit these people from the local levels before you build them up to things like either federal politics or state politics or other bigger forms of politics. In a moment. The first thing is that you firstly are less likely to get people who are connected to the community because you don't have these people who went through the community, because you're more likely to recruit either people straight from university, people who aren't caring as much, which means that your politicians are less connected, less empathetic, less understanding of these things, which is bad because then when they get into policy, they're less able to make these decisions. Or secondly, you just get people who are generally less motivated to make decisions. Because the problem is that in counterfactual and on their side, there are people who use politics as a springboard for their careers, as job POIs, as they don't sufficiently respond. The problem specifically with this is that then again, these are individuals who are less likely to be to make productive decisions. These are people who are less likely to be productive for politics. And then, where it's not as tenable under that side. Before I move on to further impacts, I take it, Brendan.
Your speech has me very concerned. If it's true, we should absolutely gut the salaries for these guys and not pay them very more or reduce their pay significantly. Because otherwise, we've got people who won't care running in politics.
But the explanation that we provide is that the system is sufficient at the moment, and what that explains is that you only provide more incentive to further push out individuals. So it's like a comparative thing. Maybe we should reduce policy, but then the point where we explain is increasing is in of itself bad, and that's something we want to avoid. Again, be compared, and so that's the comparison that we likely explain. But the second thing is that we likely think it leads to worse politicians who make worse decisions. These are individuals that do impact massive people. These are things like welfare. These are things like ag subsidies. These are things like zoning laws, which just just do make people's lives markedly worse. Things like school zones and things like all that kind of stuff. You only further encourage those things, which suggests that on net, you get worse of the less of the politician that you care about. These are individuals who entered politics because they cared about politics. When you have more people who didn't care about politics entering it for money, that then only suggests for people, that only pushes these individuals out. Second thing to explain is that you basically, the mechanism in which you go about collecting this money and like in that collecting these salaries is bad, because that then only further incurs either public debt or leads to a further worsening of the rift in America. The framing is that in order to get the money to supply these individuals, to supply these politicians' salaries, you have to redistribute federal and state budgets. Oftentimes to pay this, you have to redirect crucial monies, e.g. from like agriculture, for things like central agencies, state agencies, things like education, things like the wages of other individuals, things like the mailing service and other stuff. The impact of this is either firstly, people just don't trust anyone in government anymore because they have to take more money by taxing them more, and that's bad. Or you further remove their services. And this is bad because these people are already disengaged in the political system. You only allow the rhetoric of Donald Trump and anti-establishmentarian individuals to further point out the failure of their existence, the failure of the government to provide support for them. You only further push these people away, and so these people feel especially bad, especially in the Midwest, where there are a lot of just there are either mining towns or reliant on mining and farming. These are individuals who don't have the salaries in order to pay for the politicians as much. So you just worsen the rift. Or secondly, there are just states normally there are states who are unable to pay for it. Perhaps in the game.
It is 8:15, right?
Pardon?
It is 8:15.
I think it's quite telling that the logic of the negative team's case leads them to concede that they would be willing to reduce the salary of congressional staff in the status quo. This is insane to me because we want to have good salaries for two reasons. Firstly, we care about, I guess, upholding the professionalism of the people who engage in such important activity as a negative team. It concedes. But also, if you reduce the salaries so significantly, such that it is below that of inflation, you just let all of the rich people have a gamut of politics because you no longer have those who need money as economics means. You no longer give them an incentive to engage in politics in the status quo. That is obviously something that is really bad. I'm going to do two things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the quality of governance, and then I'm going to secondly push back on their main substantive push about political accountability. I will integrate a new piece of substantive in the first point. On the quality of governance, there was a dearth of response to our main push that increasing pay leads to good governance. Note that governance is just a really important issue in the status quo. You have such a little trust in the quality of congressional governance in the status quo. No, thank you. And it's so important to retain the institutional knowledge that we have in the status quo, especially when you think about the implication. When you no longer have these experienced people retained, you leave it to be young, inexperienced people. And an implication of this in a new piece of substantive is essentially that you just have to now rely on political consultants and firms to get advice. You have young and inexperienced people who now have to consult private consultants and firms. They expend so much money of their campaign budget in consulting them. This is obviously so bad because these are often privately owned. Secondly, they aren't just interested in the specific district's needs or the needs of their constituents. They don't care about what's the best policy for them. Instead, they give advice that is alongside the political party lines. It's what is in vogue. A really good example of this is, no thank you, Liz Cheney, who was quite anti-Trump in her stance, and that was her line. But she was advised by her political advisors to retract her anti-Trump stance because all of the other Republican parties who also hire this political consultant firm were threatening to withdraw their contracts. Obviously, this is a huge conflict of interest that means that it means that when you are young and inexperienced and you were relying on these private consultants firms, you just have a perversion of the course of democracy. You are just reliant on these people. Contrast to that to what we get on our side, where you have experienced staff who are capable of balancing the needs of their constituents, responsive to their needs, but also engaging in, important trade-offs. This is something you uniquely get when you increase pay, you retain talent, but you also also make it more attractive for more talent in a way that is really important. I'll take that point, yeah.
We explain that this model changes the path of a career politician. Because what we explain is that now it's tenable to enter career politics immediately because you can worth it instead of going through industry first, where you do have the experience in order to properly make decisions, which then flips this harm on its head.
Yeah, I'm going to respond to that now on your, I guess, the way in which you change incentives. I just don't think this is true because if anything, it's worse on your side, where you literally have only the people who can engage in politics in the status quo are just 22-year-olds who are willing to, I guess, to suffer low pay. And I just don't think you change the incentives in such tangible ways. You say that your ideal politician is one that doesn't care about money. We push back on that because money is so important in terms of just allowing people to live, but also the implication of this is that you just have ideologues now who are willing to make that I guess massive pay cut. We wouldn't want ideologues who are the most extreme people. They have often been socialized by their family to care about their party line, and that specifically, I don't think it is such a bad idea that you have people now with work experience to engage in politics. But I would push back on that further because I just think this is symmetric. In the status quo, a lot of people care about the resume of those who enter Congress. Specifically, like, I guess an example of this is you often have to already serve the military in order for you to be an ideal congressional candidate. Like, it's not like you're going to massively subvert people's incentive or the pathway into politics. You obviously already in the status quo have to have some sort of network. You have to have a work experience. But finally, I just don't think the impact that you claim is true. I don't think you get people being put offside so badly. People vote GOP or like the Democrats anyway. It's rare for even politicians who look amazing on paper to outperform the national swing towards the party. I just don't think you get such a perversion of incentives. But even if this were the case, trade that off to what we tell you the harms are of the status quo, where you literally have 22-year-olds who are willing to put up with a little pay, who are willing to put up with the poor housing conditions in Washington, D.C., where you have to bunk with other people of your age. Like, obviously, that is so bad because it means you just have a dearth of talent. And I think the second harm that you say about how this is going to be a springboard towards industry is just like worse on your side because we tell you the imperative to get into private industry in the status quo is the money that you can obtain from doing so, because it is just it is what people have to do in order to further their careers. If you see that your wage hasn't gone up in 10 years or so of serving Congress, obviously on your side you're going to look towards private industry. You're going to look towards corporate careers, and this is where all of our harms are actualized about how you pervert democracy, because we tell you get the revolving door mechanism whereby you have corporate lobbying, which is just such a big threat to democracy. This cannot be overstated. Note that this is such a bidirectional effect of corruption, because if you are an industry professional, now you know who to ask. You've already done all that networking. You just can do all of these backroom deals. But secondly, if you are like a Congress member who wants to get into lobbying in your future career because you need the money, you're going to be apprehensive about keeping people on side. You're going to be extra cautious. This is obviously bad because it allows defense contractors, it allows like pharmaceuticals, it allows people like AI industries to have an overstated say on politics in a way that is just simply democratic. And you should care about democracy, obviously, because it is the only way in which we can constrain the power that we afford to the state. So, what we tell you in our case is quite simple. We tell you that when you increase pay, you get better governance because you stop experienced people from leaving, because you now recruit more talent. Note that this talent is often more diverse because now you can allow people who wouldn't otherwise be capable of making the sacrifice of the status quo to enter politics. And this is so important because competence is literally a prerequisite to all of the effects of trust in governance. You need confidence in, especially the Congress, which is so small in the status quo. You need that as a prerequisite to get trust in the institution. And this trust is really important because if you are skeptical of the powers of Congress, if you want to constrain their powers, it means they are less able to pass bills through in a timely manner. They are just less capable of having the public on side and pushing through policy that is just so important. And I would note that the way in which the Constitution is structured is such that the Constitution has such a large effect on people's lives. This effect is so tangible, and is therefore why you ought to care about how the quality of congressional staff in the status quo.
Important quality of someone in Congress and the types of actors that we talked about is care. Care for their party, care for the cause that they represent, and care for the things that they talk about. What dooms this affirmative team is when they emphasize and massively redistribute the incentives on cost and money. Because you crowd out the young people that this team wants to benefit. You crowd out the people who do care, and you replace them with consultants. You replace them with people who cared not about the politics or the job that they were doing here, but they cared about using this as a springboard to go into business, to go into consultancy. And what dooms them then is you don't get people staying in this position at best, or at worst, you get people who stay in this position, but they do so without the care, and that means that you exacerbate the harms that we tell you on our side. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on the quality of politicians, and secondly, on the state of politics. On the quality of politicians, the first thing to note is that Brendan's POI here lacks nuance, because what we tell you is that in the status quo, there are perhaps some imbalances, but when you emphasize cost, you worsen these, because you crowd out the people. So the trade-off here isn't pay them more or pay them nothing, right? That was not what this debate was about. But because the trade-off is we were happy to lose some guy who graduated from an Ivy League and wanted to use this to go and work at a consulting firm versus filling them with people who care. And in the status quo, we had rich people and people who were in these sorts of fields and had expertise, but the comparative was that they cared about this profession and they cared about this job. Okay, the first thing to note here is, what do the people in power and the people that this team benefit look like? Because they want to tell you that it's large and that it is everyone who needs money apparently, but that's not true. It's actually a far smaller stakeholder than this. It is people who are already in these positions of power, which means that they're not passionate about the cause that they're able to springboard. Look back at your notes on August material on why these are not ideal politicians and these are not people you want into power. And thirdly, and most importantly, the pro-business incentives that they have don't change, right? This team outlines that they exist, but they don't tell you how they change. What does change is that they translate into how they interact with politics. So it is no longer just personally they might like businesses or something, and they don't want to annoy them, but now their political decisions and the things that they do in that position of power reflect that. You get more pro-business rhetoric, you get more economic rhetoric or whatever, which means that there are two things that happen on this team's side. Either they do leave eventually and go into another job, which means that the benefit that this team tells you on, oh, we get people sticking around, just does not exist. Or they do stay, and when they stay in this job, they do bad things, which means that the harm that we give you at August, which is that they do bad things or whatever, I don't know, look up at your notes, just gets increased to a far wider scale, right? Okay. The second thing that they have here is what is left is just that money is important, and maybe they give people more money, and that is the benefit they want to claim. But we can just flip that as well, because we give it to the people who actually need it. Look at the material I gave you before. The people who they benefit are already qualified, so the benefit that they have on the affirmative team is marginal. The second thing that they say is that these people might be inexperienced, and that is bad. But the first response here is the people who make the big decisions are already in departments, as we hear in that previous speech. So the harm that they give you in this thing is mitigated, and their inexperience is unlikely to trickle down to other aspects. But secondly, and most importantly, just look at the calculus of a young person here, because both teams sort of try to go for the same impact of benefiting a similar stakeholder, but they do so in different ways. Do they want to be crowded out, talked over, and stepped on at this affirmative team side by people who are seen as more professional than them, who are seen as coming from more educated or better fields, but actually just did not care? Or did they at least want to have a voice on our side, a voice to represent the party, the people who they cared about? It was pretty clear that they wanted the latter. What are the impacts then? Because at this point, we show you that the quality of politicians decreases at best. It decreases far worse at best, or it stagnates and becomes worse over a long period of time. Three things. Firstly, you crowd out younger people and people who cared about the cause, which was a stakeholder that both teams wanted to benefit, so harm to that must be weighed far highly. Secondly, people on the ground are far worse represented because you see some white consultant man at the head of your party. You don't see someone who represents you, and that was already a problem in the United States, and you exacerbated that over a far higher time strain. Thirdly, you entrench the imbalances that exist. This team points to some structural imbalances that are worse for people who are not in the highest positions of power. They make these far worse. So, if you ought buy that those things are harms of the status quo as laid out by First Affirmative, this part of my speech shows that you not only flip those harms, but make them far worse on this affirmative team side. So if you bought that setup, then you ought buy that that is just worse to like a 3 times degree on their side. Second thing here, they had 2 other things then. The first is that you have more talented individuals on our side, that you have less talented individuals on our side because the people who don't want money are somehow weird. That seems classist to me, because you don't want money, therefore you are a weird person who is like a crazy right-winger or left-winger. Unclear why that is true. But secondly, we tell you that care is good. It means that you're accountable. It means that you care about the things that you are doing, and it means that you are more likely to get things done. Second thing on the state of politics then. They tell you that processes are more efficient. Even if this were true, which I tell you is not, it is likely to be short term. Maybe one natural disaster gets solved, but the next one is unlikely to get solved because people cycle through it because we tell you that they leave, you are less likely to solve problems. Secondly, they talk about trust. This just does not work because you expend so much political will on our side, on their side. You have to say that this is more important than, say, doing things about the housing crisis. Spending money here is important, and they have the fiat to say that they expend political will and allow that to occur. But that means that you no longer have political will to allow people discussion on other things. There is no discussion on the electoral colleges or making voting easier. That discussion is far deprioritized. I'll take a point.
Who's more likely to have the family money to afford moving to DC for a year? Someone who went to an Ivy League school, or someone who went to a state school and comes from a poor background?
Yeah, but that's not the comparative in this debate, because the types of people who were already having the money are the people that you benefited, right? You give them more money, but the people who did not have money are the ones who are screwed over on our side. Thank you for making that comparative for me. Okay, why is the cost particularly bad then? And note, this is unresponded to down the affirmative team's bench. Because, firstly, this just takes money from elsewhere, right? It takes money away from farmers who rely on state subsidies. It takes money away from environmental causes. It takes money away from other things that the party wants to do. So, even if, at our very worst, you buy that this party had X amount of resources to do Y amount of work, this team decreases Y by I don't know, like 80%, because they use so much money to increase their salary. Note, this team's benefits are reliant on you increasing the salary of these people. So they're reliant on you using a large amount of money. We tell you that that money, A, brings about a large amount of harms, as said in the past 7.5 minutes of my speech, but also B, stops you from doing things that would benefit your party. At the end of this speech then, this affirmative team is doomed on 2 grounds. First, they largely worsen the types of people who are in power and who do things for policy. They make them people who are money-minded, people who don't care about the issue. And secondly, they waste an increasingly large amount of resources, putting the US political landscape in a far worse state.
Thanks. In DC right now, there are some members of Congress who have to share apartments with their staff. There are some people who have to sleep in their offices like 2-3 days a week because they have an apartment sharing agreement where they only get the apartment for parts of the week, right? Think about it this way. Which group of person is more likely to want to go and work for a corporate lobbying firm on K Street arguing for pharmaceutical companies? Someone who has to have a roommate and doesn't get to stay in their apartment for most of the week? Or someone who has enough money to afford an apartment of their own or for a far more comfortable living situation? If you have ever been in a situation where you would like to have like your own room and like a bathroom that you have, you're probably quite likely to understand why sleeping in your office several nights a week is just not a particularly viable thing when the other people who you're competing with in the rental market are people who work at the FBI and earn actual like proper money, right? Or people who work in K Street and earn disgusting like fuck off money. Like this is the problem for the negative team because like they talk a lot about care, right? They're like, well, you don't care enough, you don't care enough. The problem is everyone has to care about money. Money is the thing that allows you to care. If you pay people more, you have a set of people who are capable of caring, who are financially in a position where they can do good work. I don't understand why this negative team is so desperate to underpay the set of people who are in charge of running one of a large, complex democracy that has attached to it the world's largest military and perhaps the most important economy in the world. Like, if you care at all about like the fate of the globe, right, you should care that the people in US Congress are competent and not nut jobs, like, and I'll get to this later, not nut jobs, the only people who are willing to take the pay cut are either nut jobs or 22-year-old Harvard graduates. All right, the first thing I'm going to do in this speech, I'm going to talk about the ideal politician, then I'm going to talk about like whether this is too expensive, and then I'm going to rehash the material properly. So, let's talk about the ideal politician. The opposition says that the current like glide path for people who, you know, in politics is they like go out, they kind of go out into the world, they like learn to forage for themselves, they like have a great other job, a wonderful flourishing career, and then they eventually come back to politics. I would point out that that is not what happens. If you have a really successful career outside of politics, you tend to like stay in your successful career because that is what people who have successful careers do. They like to keep having a successful career instead of pivoting and joining the giant like clusterfuck in DC. What is instead what happens, and this is an important thing to realize, is that the only people who join politics or who go to, you know, like who are willing to sleep in their office or who are willing to share an apartment with 5 other staffers, right, are very young idealistic people, typically from wealthy backgrounds, right, because they're the ones who can afford it, they're the ones who have the family safety net, who've never really needed to worry about the idea they may not get a job one day. It's obviously like the talented kind of person from minority background who went to a state school, right, like not like one of the Ivies, who might be really interested in politics, but is incapable of doing so because they know that they can make a bunch more money in corporate America, and that's really what they and their family need them to do, and they can't even work in DC, and they can't make that trade-off. So, let's now talk a little bit about, like, I guess this idea of caring. So, there are a couple of claims that sort of is made in August's speech, like you have to be, in the status quo you have to be in industry first. I think that's untrue. Also, Anna provides a very nice response to point out that if you want to get voted in, you typically have to have a pretty glittering resume, like where you're an astronaut and also like a fighter pilot, blah, blah, blah. And even if that's not true, right, most voters just kind of vote blue and red. Like, it's very rare for individual politicians to outperform the national swing as per the district, right? So it's quite likely to just vote for the party. I'd also point out, this makes, as I'll talk about a little bit later, this policy makes parties more powerful because of the consulting firm mechanism that Anna explains in her speech. And it's not the case that you have to get, like, the parties in the US are very weak. You can call yourself a Democrat and run, and then you're a Democrat. Like, that's all that really matters. You don't have, like, Bernie Sanders is not even a Democrat and ran for the Democratic nomination. The party's not very powerful. The GOP couldn't stop Trump. They just absolutely could not do it. They couldn't get it together because the parties aren't that powerful. Let's talk about care. We just explained, like, we have on side affirmative, the very humble, like, we go back to Max Weber, we read it during prep, right? Politics is vocation, right? We think that if you're in politics is a complicated, tough job, you should do it for a while, and you should be paid well to do it, and you shouldn't go somewhere else and kind of have a kind of, I guess, like the Cincinnati view of politics, where you're like a humble farmer and you don't care about politics, and you go in, you ride in a big horse, you like save the world briefly, and then you leave. Like, we don't like that. We don't like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We like people who are good at their jobs, who understand like where the bathrooms are, and like how bills work, and can get stuff done in a timely fashion, so that we don't have, for example, compensation packages for 9/11 victims or for firefighters and 9/11 victims taking 11 years to process, and instead of like 5 years ideally, right? The other thing we point out though is that, like, unfortunately, because of the way that money works and because of the way that, like, having a human body which requires like input needs and like food and housing and stuff, you need to have You need to pay people well in order for them to be able to care about politics. And to their side, the trade-off that they try and push is like, oh, you either care about money or you either care about other things. Unfortunately, people usually, even ones who have very sincere political beliefs, have to also like pay the rent, etc., which is why it's important to be able to pay them. And with all of the structural reasons that we point out, right? Like, which is median pay in other professions has gone up over the past 20 years. DC housing costs have risen faster than the national average, and also, ever since like, I guess 1994 or thereabouts, when Newt Gingrich ran on a really aggressive small government thing, it's been very hard to raise congressional salaries, which is like just politically, like the Republicans always trash it, and a lot of individual politicians have personal political incentives to grandstand in front of the media by talking about how we shouldn't pay politicians too much, which is why they've been underpaid, and which is why we have like literally the deprofessionalization of politics as we speak. I'll take a point of information.
These benefits are nice and all, but why do you get these less well-off individuals who can't afford housing into politics in the first place, given that we explain that political parties won't select them to even...
Okay, cool. One, we pay them more, so you can, like, a whole bunch of these people self-select out. That's our mechanism. They go to they're a talented person who's interested in politics, but they feel like they can't accept the little amount of money they get from politics when they can get money elsewhere. Also, this party selection mechanism thing, you guys have as I said, a very overstated belief in the power of the political party. You can run for a seat and call yourself a Democrat insofar that you win pre-selection, you're now a member of the Democratic Party or whatever. And the other thing I'd point out as well is that, like, as I'll talk about in a second, what happens is when you're a member of Congress and all of your staff are like children, when you need good advice from people who've been around a while, you have to go to one of the private consulting firms full of people who are about your age and actually know things. And the problem, right, is that those corporate consulting firms are paid for by the party, right? You go to your campaign fundraising when you have a lot of money, unlike your personal bank account, and you pay for them to help you. The problem is, if you're doing things your party doesn't like, the rest of your party can tell the consulting firm, don't work with X, otherwise we'll blackball you and we'll cut all your contracts, which is what happened to Liz Cheney, right? The parties use the fact that they don't pay staffers very much as a means of disciplining individual members, right? Like, if you're concerned about polarization and partisanship and overall party control, paying individual members more so less reliant on fundraising structures and less reliant on external political consultants is actually the move. Other stuff, okay, so they talk a little bit about like entrenching imbalances. I hope it's already clear why paying people more allows marginalized people more access to politics because they actually consider it, because they can actually afford it. But I also point out, like, when you select out a bunch of talented people who care about politics, what you're left is untalented people who care about politics, or people who are extremely ideologically and interested in politics, which is what we mean. This is the difference between getting someone who's like right-wing but like vaguely competent and someone who's a complete QAnon nutjob. Like, this is the difference there, because the vaguely right-wing person goes and works for a consulting firm instead of running for politics, or instead of becoming a member of Congress and having a vote. Finally, let's talk about public debt. We think it's completely worth it to have a competent Congress, like, given the size and importance of the US economy and the US as a whole. We point out we're talking about tens of millions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars in an economy worth trillions of dollars. We can easily afford this by like eliminating a weird tax deduction for corn farmers who happen to be born on the 4th of July, or a Pentagon research program into an invisibility cloak. Like, this is not a problem. This is unlikely to cause very much increase in cost. It is incredibly important. We pay people well. Politics is a vocation, and it should be treated as such.
3 questions in this speech. First is, what is the cost of this policy? The second is, what kind of people would likely be gotten on the side of the affirming team. The last thing I'm going to talk about is how voters are likely to react. So let's first talk about what's the cost of this policy. An affirmative team obviously is fiat, but this still means that the money is redirected from somewhere. And what we note is that this comes from clearly the federal budget or the state level budget at the very least, meaning to say that to significantly pay federal officials, elected officials and state level elected officials, you would have to, in a federal system in the US politics, necessarily redirect money away from subsidies, like Brendan has already considered to his detriment. But secondly, from important state agencies like the US Postal Service, that's incredibly important for mail-in ballots for democratic participation. So it's unclear why those things are things that are worth trading on. That is the key thing that we want to note as a strategic observation for the other side. Because the affirming team in this debate has just failed to do any trade-off analysis besides asserting that there are some benefits that come from this policy without weighing across the immense democratic and economic costs from doing so. That was the reason why they've already lost this debate. More importantly, for these guys to cut the immense cost, and therefore the corresponding set of harms from those costs, because solving the problem of like retaining talent by giving competitive salaries that are competitive with the private sector, and solving the problem of donor and lobby and corporate capture means that you have to significantly increase your salaries. Meaning that on their side, they have to necessarily defend three important harms. The first thing, and I think they never responded to this at all satisfactorily, is this, that inequality between different states, like for example, richer and affluent states that rely on services that are not really subsidized, like financial services in California, in places like New York, those particular wealthier states get more wealthy over time and are able to draw in the sort of private sector talent that you guys necessarily want to have. In, for example, the Midwest, where textile and manufacturing jobs are heavily subsidized up till this day, in the Sunbelt states like Arizona, and like in the Midwest states when it comes to farming and mining subsidies to help their workers remain globally competitive. Those particular state-level budgets for subsidizing those industries and keeping employment up and therefore productivity up and tax revenue for that particular poor state to deliver its important social services all are significantly decreased correspondingly and proportionally to the significant increase in these elected officials' salaries. Unclear why that was necessarily a good thing to have, given that, as they wanted to suggest, this debate is also about politics in terms of the polarization and the inequality that drives the desire for demagogues and ideologues to be in power. How are you going to solve that problem on their side? The framing completely destroys itself and is self-defeating here. The second harm that I think they have to really deal with is what Galp tells you in second, which is that there's significant political capital expended for this particular policy. If it is true, and as we've told you before, that this clearly hits those Midwest, Rust Belt, Sun Belt voters the hardest, takes away their jobs and all that, it means that there's very little corresponding political capital and will for politicians as a whole, as representatives of the electorates, to do anything further to try to reform the electoral college, to do things like remove super PAC influence anyway. There are so many alternatives to democratic reform to help ensure that we reduce polarization and increase trust in the government by removing these particular special interest groups out of power. These guys expend all the political capital with this particular policy that basically throws money at the problem and then expends all the political motivation and desire from voters to want to do anything further, because that's basically a problem that has been solved at a great expense to them directly. That gives the entire reformist movement for democratic politics in the United States a bad reputation that is hard to reverse, and it's something that already exists right now. So they worsen it significantly, they worsen trust in politics, they worsen polarization. That's the reason why at the end of the day they've lost. But the third harm that they have to necessarily cop in this debate is this, that federal and state services that are provided to people, things like healthcare services, things like, for example, education services, transport services, are all important lubricants for the domestic local level economies to function. All that tax revenue is basically slashed and moved towards paying state level officials and locally elected officials higher salaries, and it's unclear why that necessarily solves the problem. These guys are very misleading. Their claim is, people in New York, AOC can't afford her rent. Yeah, she's screaming and whining about rent. That's true, but she has the apartment. The problem is not with the elected officials. The problem is with the staffers. So on your side, you redistribute all the money that you have for staffing and making sure those staffers get an apartment to making AOC live in a more comfortable apartment. That's not the comparative, yeah? So let's be very clear about the reality check that needs to happen in this debate, yeah? So I want to be very clear about this. This is not the comparative. That's also their case is based on a weird misinformation. The problem right now is that those staffers and advisors are the ones that are burnt out. They're not paid enough. You worsen the underpayment problem. On our side of the house, what we told you was this, that it was more important, far more important, that we were able to restore some level of trust in the democracy by reducing costs on the average voter, and that was really important. Second thing to talk about then in this speech, no thank you, is what kind of people would you like to get? And this is an important clash. They can't get away with not proving that this actually leads to people that they want, right? Their mechanism concedes that they draw people who are fundamentally motivated by money, no matter how you slice the cake on their side of the house. Because for their policy to work, you must appeal to people who want their pay to be competitive. Problem is this, we already told you Gus, and Gus already has won the debate here when he told you specifically that people see this as a springboard. These young people are your preppy, private or public IB university graduates who basically would have, correctly pointed out by Jess in her speech, would not have gone into politics because they didn't think of it as being financially worth it to do so. Now they want to do it because it tips them across the margin, because what happens is that now you're more likely to want to go into politics to leverage on connections, to start fake focused consultancy groups with political consultants from McKinsey anyway, right? Because they want to use this as a way to network with all these other people that they would have otherwise not been able to network with or get an interview with as someone who just graduated from university. So this first person that you get, the kind of young people you get on your side for recruitment purposes, would be your annoying, insufferable person that's hard to work with because they ultimately are individuals that have no reason for parties' political longevity. They are not there to groom the younger generation of career politicians. They are more likely to crowd out the opinions of people like AOC, young people like in the squad, because ultimately these people are the ones that are always carrying more but are in smaller progressive caucuses. These young rich people form bigger caucuses on their side of the house within the Democrat Party. It's harder significantly for people like young people like AOC to actually do any good in that particular context. So on our side, we're happy to trade off dinosaurs like Mitch McConnell and young asswipes like Paul Ryan, who eventually went into like consultancy anyway in McKinsey after being voted out in the US federal election. No thank you. Last, let's talk about what happens with voters' reactions. To note here, the backdrop is very clear. The US currently faces a cost of living crisis because of inflation that has been sustained by the federal bank. What we note here is that currently the problem is that Trump is very, very, very popular because he's seen as not being out of touch. We are out of time. Being someone that's out of touch often just means that, like, you are seen as someone that hides behind your ivory tower of privilege and all of that. The problem here is this, that being out of touch right now on their side looks like the case because you think you're deserving of a wage increase in a time where real wages have slowed to a halt in the United States for the average worker. How will voters react to this policy? They never really had a satisfactory response to this. Galt already impacted this in his speech. Because not only do you pay more, the bill is paid by your farmers and the factory workers that they considered in Brandon's speech. And as a result of that, they rely on the those people that rely on subsidies end up being more susceptible to your ideologues. They're more susceptible to Trump. They're more susceptible to populist rhetoric at the end of the day. So they don't solve the trust issue. They don't solve the problem of making sure that they are able to make more politically effective decisions. And that's the reason why we should go with our side of the house.